Hey everyone, it's the Eclectic Dev. Today we're going to look at 8 tips using GitHub Copilot to make sure we use its capabilities to its fullest. Let's check it out. All right, so let's get into the 8 tips using GitHub Copilot. Now, these tips are in no particular order, so make sure you'll stay to the end so that you can get all of the information. Also, these tips do not matter which IDE you're using, whether that's Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, or one of the other supported IDEs. It doesn't matter which language or technology stack you're using. These tips will work across all of them. Also, if you're new to the channel, welcome. Make sure to hit the subscribe below, and let's get into these tips. Starting with tip number 1, know your GitHub Copilot agents and / commands. All right, so if I go over to GitHub Copilot chat, which is right here, there are ways to be expressive in nature with our code files more quickly than having to type out long prompts. And the way we do that is through agents and / commands. The easiest way to get to them is to say /help. Now, I know in some tooling, when you ask for the help, you get just inundated with commands. But the cool thing with GitHub Copilot, as you can see right here, all of the agents and / commands that are available are really able to take a look at within almost one eye shot. And so what are the differences between the agents and the / commands? So the agents are what start with the @ symbol, like @workspace, @VS Code, and @terminal. These are really specialized experts that can assist us with specific tasks. For example, @workspace gives us the context of our entire working code space. So all of the code files within our specific project, no matter what you're working with. So in the example of all these files, it would have access to everything that I could ask a question across it, have it build code for me, many different operations. So that's the @workspace agent. Also, asking Visual Studio Code a question @VS Code. Maybe we want to ask it something like @VS Code and say, how do I increase the font? Something in that realm. And then you can see after a few seconds here, the agent and the prompt comes back with how to actually increase the editor font size. And what I really like in this case is it provides these buttons that you can click and then it'll bring it up immediately. So that's a way you can interact with an agent about the IDE itself. Going back to the original list, again, you can also ask a question about the terminal, like how do I run the unit tests or how do I run the application? So those are the agents. The / commands are then paired up with the agents, as you can see here, nested underneath. And you have all of the different / commands, especially the ones that you should be using often, like explain and test or fix. So these ones right here, you can highlight a block of code or an entire file or give it, and you can say /explain. Now, when you do /explain, notice that there's a terminal option and a workspace option. So depending on what you're targeting, and you can ask it to explain some code. The same thing with tests. So while you can longhand type out these prompts like explain this code to me or generate tests for this block of code, the / commands provide a very concise way that quickly you can interact with Copilot. And don't forget, this is available as well when you're working in line with Copilot chat. So these different / commands, you can highlight a block of code and say explain or fix or generate tests based on that. So knowing these agents and / commands will help expedite your use with GitHub Copilot and make sure you're using it efficiently with your code. All right, so let's move on to tip number 2, which is understanding prompt engineering. So prompt engineering is the process of how we interact with GitHub Copilot, what we ask it to do for us in our IDE or wherever we are using it. Now, in reality, this could be an entire video onto itself, but wanted to spend just a couple of minutes talking about it so that we can maximize the results and the efficiency that we get back from GitHub Copilot. So again, the prompts are the way we interact. So looking at this code file right here, maybe I need some sort of sort method. So if I say generate a sort method, it's going to give me one, but that's not very specific. So it does a good job, but what if I had other details that I needed in that? So I like to make this analogy a lot with GitHub Copilot, which is say your friends are going out to lunch and they stop by your desk at work and say, "What would you like for lunch?" And you say, "Food." Well, they go off and they get you something and they come back with a soup and a sandwich. And you say, "I didn't want that. I wanted a piece of pizza with a salad and a soft drink." Well, they would have gotten you that if you were specific on what you had asked for, but you were generic. Working with GitHub Copilot is very similar to that. If we are too generic, we won't get back the completions that we want. So in this case, when we say generate a sort method, we're not being very specific. But what if I say something along the lines of generate a sort method using a supplied parameter from cabin, which is a model, and return a new collection? This time we get a method that mirrors exactly what I was looking for with the cabin type and a sort field, and it will return me what I was looking for. Now, again, don't worry about the language or the technology stack, whether you're in Python or Java or C# or any language, it doesn't matter. The process of how you interact and what you ask for is the same when using GitHub Copilot. Let's go take a look at now generating a unit test for this over in Copilot chat. So ordinarily, there's a lot of ways we could do this, but typically you could highlight something, whether it's just this method or maybe a series of methods in the file, and you want to generate some tests. Well, we know now with our / command, we could use workspace tests. But let's show that with our prompt, we can be very specific and detailed about exactly what we're looking for. And this is important to know with GitHub Copilot, because again, it's not like a genie in the bottle with only 3 wishes. You can be as detailed or as specific with the requirements of what you're looking for. So in this case, let's use our test / command, but let's add on some detail here. I'm going to say ensure to use mock cabin data for the unit test and ensure to mock out the cabin service. That's an injected service that makes HTTP calls. I don't want that to make any real calls, so I'm telling it to mock that out and do not call through to the actual code. Make sure to include positive and negative test paths using null values for cabin service being returned. All right, so now it should operate on those requirements and give me more specifically what I'm looking for. And this is what prompt engineering is about. Now, listen, if it gets you there 60, 70, 80% of the way, we may not always need to get 100%. So that prompt engineering, we can iterate with the results a little bit. But if it gets you 80, 90% of the way there, you have a massive time savings. And really, that's one of the goals of using something like this, a generative AI tool like GitHub Copilot. Now, of course, with any of the results, no matter how you craft your prompt or what you request for it, you always need to validate that code. So that's a little aside from today, but all of this should never be taken verbatim. You would go through and validate these lines of code. And after using them, maybe you would iterate and say, update this part or update that part or do what you need. So there's a little bit about prompt engineering. Again, you can be quite specific in what you're doing, whether you're working with chat or code to comments or any part with it. You want to be specific and provide details to Copilot so that it gives you the best solution. All right, let's move along to GitHub Copilot tip number 3, which is context matters. Often the question is, how does Copilot know what my code is in order to offer a solution? And so depending on where you're working with GitHub Copilot, it'll operate differently on what it's able to use. So starting with inline GitHub Copilot. So I'm here in a code file. Previously had asked to generate a sort method. Now, this particular file in this Angular application is really dependent on maybe 2 other files. One is the cabin model, which is right here, which is just an interface defining what cabin is. And it's also dependent on a cabin service that's injected, also in addition to some Angular libraries for some basic operations. So if I want Copilot to have the best context, what I can do is ensure that those additional files that I think are pertinent to asking any questions are also open. So you notice I already have the cabin model file open, but it'd probably be a good idea in this case that I also open up the cabin service that's being used. That just ensures that it has the greatest amount of awareness and context when I ask or prompt GitHub Copilot for any information that I'm about to do. Having the additional files open in additional tabs will help Copilot. Now, Copilot on its own is incredibly efficient in a vacuum, just strictly based on the public data it was trained on in its models behind the scenes. But it always can be helped, and you'll get the most efficient results if you have open the pertinent tabs or code files that are associated with what you are working with. In addition, context can also be about what's visually available on the screen. So over here in GitHub Copilot chat, I don't have anything highlighted explicitly in my code file right now. What's visually shown is roughly lines 45 to 66 with my cursor around 64 right now. So if I ask workspace/explain, one of the things you'll notice that it'll do is it'll pop up here and it says, give me an enclosing range. Did you want this method? Did you want the entire component? What did you want? So in this case, maybe I would say, okay, sort cabins, and then it would give me the detail and explain that particular method. So it was actually asking me, what scope did you want? And then it proceeds to explain that code. However, if I didn't use the slash command and just had my cursor there and I said, explain this code. And so in that case, what it's going to do is after explaining, it's going to just take what is visually available on the screen. So again, that's the only context that it has right there, and then it explains that code in a vacuum. If I scroll back up, used one reference, take a note, lines 43 to 66, again, what is visible on the screen. I can also ask it to explain using a file handle. So maybe in this case, I want to say @workspace/explain, and I can use this hashtag file and give it a handle, and it will open the command palette with all of the different files. And I'm like, I really need an explanation on service, because that's what's being used here. And so I didn't have to jump over to that particular file. It's a really slick and efficient way that I can say, hey, I would like you to explain this other file because maybe in this case, I'm new to the code and I don't know exactly what that's doing. It's also prompting me at the top for which scope in reference to that. So I'm going to give it the entire component, and then it shows that it's used a couple of references, and it will talk about the cabin service and what it is doing. That would help give me context without having to necessarily switch to another file. And it actually proceeds to go ahead and explain all of the different methods that are in the cabins service. As you can see, handle error and get cabins and such. So last thing to mention again is at the @workspace agent. That is what is giving us context to the entire application. So if you need to ask something project-wide, that's when you're going to use Workspace. Maybe you're also going to have it generate code and ask it a prompt right here and say, generate, some kind of utility method or a data fetching method or whatever. And by using @workspace, it has the context of your entire application to make sure that the solutions it provides are in line and consistent with the existing code in your application. So understanding context between inline code versus chat is important and helpful when using GitHub Copilot. All right, let's move along to GitHub Copilot tip number 4, which is looking at alternative solutions. So this is applicable to GitHub Copilot inline. So whether you're using code to comment or you've hit the return key and you've been offered a method or a line of code, there is the opportunity and capability to look at alternative solutions, and not everyone is aware about that. So here on line 53, I have a comment that is prompting GitHub Copilot to generate a sort method using a supplied parameter as we had looked at before. Now, when I hit return, it offers a method. Now that method is in gray and not accepted until I hit the tab key. I have the opportunity here in Visual Studio Code to hit Control Enter. That will synthesize and bring up Copilot's additional suggestions for that implementation. Again, it could be a single line of code, it might be a method, but it does offer multiple suggestions. So you can go through and take a look and see what those additional suggestions would be. For example, looking at different ways that this sort cabin method could be implemented. Here's a sort cabins by. Here is another one that's got sort cabins with a switch statement. So you have a couple of different options. You can either go back to your original prompt or comment and try to refactor it. Again, that prompt engineering from step number 2 to get exactly what you want. Or in this case, we can look at additional suggestions for what we want. And what's really cool is we can hit this button right here, which says accept suggestion, and it will inject that code. Often it's asked, are these in order of how great they're perceived the solution is? And they are not. There's no rhyme or reason. I've had to go down to solution 3 or 7, or maybe sometimes it's suggestion 1, and you can suggest that. Again, that's all enter to bring up that additional suggestions pane. Looking at another quick example of this, maybe it's just an inline. I just want to say sort the cabins, and let's say by name. And so it already is telling me that. It comes up, sort the cabins by name. It gives me something. Again, I can hit Alt Enter. It will come up before I've accepted that. Provide me with additional suggestions in the pane here. And as it begins to add some additional ones, maybe I was after this one. Again, I could use that link and then I could insert it in, and it has actually duplicated that code right there. So I can remove that out, and then I can take that alternate suggested line. So again, using Alt Enter is a great way when you're in line with Copilot to look at additional solutions and suggestions that one of those offered up might be more applicable to you. All right, let's move along to GitHub Copilot tip number 5, which is refactoring and optimizing code. So one of the most powerful features of GitHub Copilot is to be able to assess and analyze existing code that you have written and see if it could be refactored or optimized. You can also assess it for security concerns as well, which is a really helpful provided insight to some code that you may have written because you just want to double check before it gets all the way to, say, build servers and penetrations testing and things of that nature, and you want to check it on the spot. So taking a look here at an example in this cabin service, it has this method to make an HP call. It gets the data, it subscribes to an observable, then it has the opportunity to manipulate that data or do presentation layer logic and then return or at least broadcast that data through the observable. So maybe this method is doing a little bit too much. So we can highlight this method and go over to GitHub Copilot chat, and then we can do something along the lines of refactor this code into multiple methods. This should take it and do an assessment on it. It gives us the capability into making multiple methods. So here it breaks down a fetch cabins, a handle response, and an update cabin source. Also, it has the original method. That way that the API surface or the caller isn't disrupted. And so in this case, I really do like the breakdown. Now, again, I was being very abstract about my inquiry to say, refactor this method. I could have added more specificity like I talked about in tip number 2 with prompt engineering to be very specific about what I wanted. I can also, with that same method, I could say optimize this code. It will go through and say it's actually quite efficient already, but we can break it down to be more readable and maintainable. So while refactoring in this instance happens to be a part of that, and it makes a very similar suggestion, it may not always. If you're familiar with like assessment tools, especially within the different IDEs for cyclomatic complexity and if statements and nested ifs and switch statements and monolithic methods. This is a great opportunity to say, take a look at this code and optimize it. It's really strong, I'd say, in the area of legacy code, however that is you define it, older code that was written, to give an opportunity to look at it and say, can you make this code better? I can also ask something like, is this code secure? And the reason I might do that is maybe I had to implement, it's making an HTTP call. Do I have it in the right order? And it tells me that it is pretty secure overall there, but there's a few things you can consider. So for example, it's not using HTTPS for maybe this URL right here, or the error handling, the data validation. So it's giving some pointers. Now I have highlighted code before that is using known anti-patterns and insecure coding practices, and it will immediately say, no, this code is not secure. So from refactoring code to optimizing code to checking if code's secure, these are all things that you can do with GitHub Copilot through GitHub Copilot chat that'll help us maximize our use with the tool. All right, let's move along to GitHub Copilot tip number 6, which is maximizing Copilot's features to do research directly in the IDE and stay in the flow. So ordinarily, if you are stumped on something or have a question or need to research something, you would go out to a browser and start searching for whatever question that you had. You might end up on Stack Overflow or in Reddit or on some blog post or official docs. But the capability exists directly in the IDE with GitHub Copilot Chat to do the research that we need and stay in the flow without breaking context or concentration. Let's go ahead and look at an example. All right, so I've added a prompt here that says, how can I create a deep copy of an object collection that contains functions in JavaScript and doesn't use the Lodash library? Show an example. So the Lodash library is very famous for having the deep copy functionality, but in this case, I want to research how can I do it in JavaScript alone. So I'm going to ask Copilot about that and also see an example of it. Now, ordinarily, I know I could use a shallow copy with json.parse, but I needed to investigate and find a better example of that. So it's giving me an example here of a deep copy method and its usage, and then it goes in as well as explaining that it recursively copies all the properties on an object. It binds the function to the new object to ensure this works correctly. If the property is primitive, then it simply copies it. The long and the short here is that it is being able to provide solutions to me without having to leave the IDE. And no, this is not an extension of the browser. If you're new to Copilot, that didn't go do a search on the web. That's still using the large language models behind Copilot to come up with these solutions that are probabilistic in nature. So each time you ask, you may get a slight variation on it, but we're allowed to and able to ask our questions. Also, the questions do not have to be specific to the context of your code or the stack that you're on. I can ask any independent technology related question right here in chat. For example, let's add another one. Here's something I wanted to ask Azure about. In Azure, if I place my Azure functions behind APIM, can I get the auth claims that is accessing the functions from the user in JavaScript code? So this is an example where I haven't done this yet, and I'm looking to ask this question without having to dig through the docs. And it says, yes, you can do that. You can get those claims, and here's a step-by-step guide, including the policy for APIM, and then on the claims itself, here is how we can access the claims within JavaScript within the Azure function. So it gives a full solution and a step-by-step guide. So you can really see the power here of GitHub Copilot, not having to break flow, context, and concentration. We can ask those research questions directly within Copilot chat. All right, next up is tip number 7, which is managing or dealing with solutions in GitHub Copilot chat that are blocked because they match public code. So here out on my GitHub account, and if you were to go to yours and look at your license, under your Copilot, there's going to be a setting regarding matching public code and whether that is allowed or enabled or blocked, which is right here. Suggestions matching public code, which is currently blocked. Now that is controlled at the organization or enterprise level. And in most cases, that is the default and should be used option of blocked. So let's go ahead and take a look at example in Visual Studio Code. All right, here in Copilot Chat, I have one of my previous examples pulled up from the research tip about creating a deep copy method without using Lodash. Now, this is a slightly modified version that has to be a little bit problematic with getting the response. So if I go ahead and submit this to Copilot Chat, it will start to offer a solution with a very similar description that we had seen before. However, once it starts getting into the code, you'll notice that you get this message here. Sorry, the response matched public code, so it was blocked. Please rephrase your prompt. And that's exactly what we need to do. It's almost a form of prompt engineering. And what's happened here, you might be questioning, it goes back to that policy setting. So the way GitHub Copilot works under the covers is the large language models have been trained on public data. And it is not a copy and paste solution mechanism. It's much more sophisticated in the generative AI techniques and the deep learning and machine learning that it's using. But what it is doing is that if it sees a pattern over and over that it thinks is a good suggestion, it may offer that as part of the solution. Remember, GitHub Copilot is probabilistic, not deterministic, so it comes up with unique solutions each time. However, if that solution matches more than 150 characters, which is roughly 2 lines of code, and for IP protection, it will block that code, and that's what's happened here. So we need a similar solution. We just need to rephrase what we are asking it to do. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, here is a modified version of that same prompt, but this time when we submit it, it should bypass that and offer a unique solution that is going to not be blocked by that public code matching. So this time we see a modified version of this particular method that it offered up before, but this time it is not being blocked. So often the solution to that problem is to recraft your prompt with additional information or changing the way that it's worded so that it gives you a solution that's unique and not blocked by public code. All right, and finally, GitHub Copilot tip number 8, which is to learn your specific IDE keyboard shortcuts. And so I'm out here on the GitHub docs, and I will leave this link in the description below, where the mainstream and supported IDEs all have tabs here. So for example, Visual Studio Code, and you can see the keyboard shortcuts for Mac or for Windows or for Linux, and the same thing if you're using one of the other supported IDEs as well. You can go down and see what those keyboard shortcuts are. So let's head back over to Visual Studio Code and try some of these out. All right, so let's test out some of our keyboard shortcuts. So we already talked about the one that when you are Copilot in line and you're offered a solution, that Control-Enter on Windows for Visual Studio Code will bring up the Copilot additional suggestions. And so that one is easy enough to get to and then evaluate those options. Also, if you are in line and you want to use Copilot Chat, not in the separate window, you can hit Control-I. That is a Copilot Chat inline input that will allow you to type in the same things that you do in chat. So if you say something like /explain, then what it'll do is very conveniently, it will hop you back over and give you the Copilot Chat window. So one of the things that you may find convenient is you will be toggling between File Explorer over here on the left and Copilot Chat often. So you can get to File Explorer with Control-Shift-E, and you can get back to Copilot Chat using Control-Alt-I. There's also the capability to get to Copilot Chat at the command or top level window, which is to use Control-Shift-I. That will bring up a Copilot Chat prompt at the top of the IDE itself, if that's where it's convenient for you. Kind of rounding this off, while it's not a keyboard shortcut, there are context menu options. So if you right click and go into Copilot, you have the ability to bring up the Copilot Chat prompt as we've shown. Also explain or fix or generate docs and some of the other functionality as well. Excellent. So that's 8 tips that hopefully accelerate your use on using GitHub Copilot within the IDE and your everyday journey with technology. Again, there may be slight variances between the different IDEs, but the docs will say what those are. But overall, these tips are indifferent to the, again, language stack, IDE, or whatever you're using. So get out there and try them. If you have other tips you want to share, put them in the comments below. Feel free to give this a like. Appreciate the support. And until next time, this is the Eclectic Dev. We'll see you later.